Have you ever walked into a place and felt like it was waiting for you? Not just a lingering silence, not just the smell of damp wood and mildew, but something deeper, a hush that isn't empty at all, but full of something that listens? That's what it felt like the moment the bus pulled off the dirt road and stopped before the clearing where the cabin stood. None of them said it aloud, but each person in that corporate team, fresh from their city jobs and their forced smiles, felt it ripple through their stomachs. This wasn't just any cabin. This was a place with a memory. The company retreat had been Harold's idea. Harold, the regional manager, always trying to inject synergy and promote resilience through bizarre weekend excursions. He thought a weekend in the woods would force his employees to connect in ways they never did in the office. Most of them hated it already. Mara, the quiet accountant who sat 2 desks down from the copier, hadn't wanted to come at all. Neither had Dan, the sarcastic IT guy who'd once said he'd rather chew glass than go camping. Still, there they were, unloading bags under the dim light of a setting sun, staring at the place that would be their home for 2 nights. The cabin was older than any of them expected. Not rustic in a charming, Airbnb way, but neglected. Its roof sagged slightly, like a bent spine under too many years. The windows were grimy, their panes streaked with dirt that no one had bothered to wash in decades. And the door, it hung a little crooked, a splinter of wood torn from the bottom as if someone had kicked it hard, once, long ago. Ivy crawled up one side of the cabin, its tendrils clinging to the wooden boards like veins on brittle skin. The place didn't look like a retreat, it looked like a warning. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the smell thick with mold and something faintly metallic, something like rust. Or blood. The furniture was mismatched, heavy oak chairs alongside a sagging sofa with stuffing pushing out through the seams. But it was the table that made Mara pause. Its surface was scarred with long, deep grooves. Not the kind left by dinner knives, but something sharper, more deliberate. She ran her fingers over them before pulling her hand back quickly, as if the grooves themselves burned. "This is cozy," Harold said too loudly, trying to disguise his unease. His voice bounced strangely in the cabin, like the walls were too close together. No one answered. The bedrooms weren't much better, dust-coated mattresses with thin blankets that smelled like wet leaves. They split into pairs, though no one was happy about it. Dan got stuck with Harold, while Mara ended up with Jess, the overly cheerful HR coordinator who had already announced she'd brought board games and thought this was going to be so much fun. As the group settled in, they began to notice little things. A framed picture on the wall, its glass cracked, showing a family of 5 who looked eerily blurred, as if the faces themselves didn't want to be remembered. A trunk in the corner that wouldn't open, no matter how much pressure was applied to its rusty lock. A rocking chair that faced the window, though the view outside was only of the tree line, dark and skeletal under the rising moon. It wasn't until Mara opened the drawer of the nightstand in her assigned room that she found the first journal. Its cover was stiff with age, the leather cracked, and when she touched it, flakes crumbled off onto her hands. The first page was filled with small, frantic handwriting. "They want us to stay. Every night they whisper louder. The woods keep count, and the cabin is their altar. If you sleep under this roof, you are theirs." Mara blinked and read the words again. She wanted to laugh it off, but her throat was dry. Instead, she slid the journal back into the drawer and said nothing. Dinner was awkward, chili heated over a camp stove, the electricity in the cabin flickering uncertainly whenever someone tried to use the outlets. They ate quickly, avoiding the shadows that seemed to pull unnaturally in the corners of the room. When the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, Jess chirped, "It's just the woods saying hello." No one laughed. Later, while the others gathered in the common room, Mara found herself wandering back into the kitchen. She noticed the stains then, dark blotches on the wooden floor near the sink. Old, yes, but unmistakable. Dried blood. She crouched, touching the edge of one, and her skin crawled. It wasn't just a stain, it was a story, a remnant of something violent. Upstairs, Dan was exploring a closet when he found another relic, a diary wrapped in yellowing cloth. Its pages were thicker than the journal Mara had seen, and the ink was smeared as if written in haste. The entry he read aloud under his breath chilled him to the bone. The ritual is incomplete. We left before dawn. We left before they could finish. But the cabin remembers. The cabin keeps count. And when the right number returns, it will be finished. Dan shoved the diary back into the cloth and stuffed it on the shelf, his heart hammering. He told himself it was nonsense, just old folklore. Still, he didn't mention it to anyone. Not yet. By midnight, the group tried to sleep. But the cabin would not let them. The wind outside rose into a howl, pressing against the walls like a living thing. Floorboards creaked when no one was moving. Somewhere in the attic, something heavy shifted, dragging across the floor with a sound that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. Jess whispered through the dark, "Did you hear that?" No one answered, though everyone had. And then came the whisper. It started faint, like breath through a crack in the wall, then grew into something layered, like multiple voices overlapping. Words not quite in English, not quite in any language they knew. Mara pulled her blanket tighter, heart thudding, as the whispers slid between the walls. They didn't just hear it, they felt it, threading through their bones, tickling their skulls. At 2:33 a.m., the whisper stopped. Silence crashed down. And then, 3 knocks on the front door. Not 4. Not 2. 3. Deliberate. Waiting. The group froze in their rooms, listening, none daring to move. And in that silence, the cabin itself seemed to breathe. The knocking didn't come again. That was almost worse. 3 deliberate raps, and then nothing, no retreating footsteps, no rustle of the trees outside, no explanation. The silence pressed so heavily against the cabin that everyone lay awake in their rooms, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sound that never came. Sleep was impossible, the air itself seemed to crawl across their skin like static, humming with something unsaid. By morning, none of them looked rested. Mara sat at the rickety kitchen table nursing black coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she cupped the mug. Jess tried to keep spirits high, babbling about how the knocks were probably just the wind, or maybe some pranksters. But no one was laughing. The woods around them were empty for miles, no roads, no other cabins, no neighbors. For someone to knock, they'd have had to walk hours through dense forest in the dead of night. That explanation didn't make sense. Dan finally broke the silence. "I don't care what that was. We need to talk about leaving. Today." His voice was clipped, not his usual sarcastic drawl. Harold frowned, clearly annoyed. "We've only just gotten here. Look, I know it's a little rustic, but this place isn't dangerous. We're adults. We can handle a creaky house." "Creaks don't knock 3 times at your door," Dan snapped back. It might have turned into a full-blown argument, but Mara interrupted. She had gone pale, staring at something on the floor near the fireplace. The others followed her gaze. There, smeared faintly across the warped wooden planks, was a set of prints, bare feet, small, as if a child had been walking through ash or soot. The prints led from the hearth toward the hallway, and then stopped abruptly, vanishing mid-floor, as if the child had simply disappeared into the air. Jess whimpered. That wasn't there yesterday." Harold insisted it must have been overlooked, but the weak protest only deepened the unease in the room. None of them could shake the feeling that the cabin hadn't just housed them, it had watched them. After breakfast, the group tried to distract themselves with activities Harold had planned. Trust exercises, silly outdoor games, all the corporate bonding nonsense. But the woods pressed in around them, the trees too tall, the branches too interlocked overhead. It felt less like fresh air and more like a cage. Every time someone glanced back toward the cabin, its dark windows stared like hollow eyes, unblinking. It was Jess who first suggested exploring the cabin itself, maybe finding something to prove there was a logical explanation for the strange things they were noticing. She framed it as an icebreaker scavenger hunt, but everyone knew it was just an excuse to look for answers. The search began innocently enough. Harold and Jess rummaged through the kitchen cupboards, finding nothing but rusted cans and brittle mouse droppings. Mara and Dan crept upstairs, where the air was colder, as though the walls themselves were leaching warmth. It was there, in the second bedroom, that Mara discovered the wardrobe. The door groaned as she pulled it open. Inside hung a row of dresses, their fabric eaten through by moths, yet eerily preserved, as if waiting for their owners to return. On the floor sat another journal, its cover torn, its pages warped by moisture. Mara opened it carefully. The writing inside was jagged, slanted, almost violent in its strokes. The circle was drawn in blood. They said the cabin would hold it, keep it until the right souls returned. We tried to break it, we burned the symbols, we broke the altar. But the woods would not let us leave. The whispers came. The knocking came. And then, one by one, they chose us. Mara shut the book with a shiver, but not before Dan caught sight of the page. "This is insane," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes lingered on the wardrobe longer than he wanted, as if expecting one of those moth-eaten dresses to shift. Downstairs, Harold had found something else. In the cellar, dark, damp, and rank with the smell of mold, he discovered furniture stacked haphazardly against one wall. When he cleared it away, he revealed a patch of floorboards stained darker than the rest, a circle etched into the wood with symbols he didn't recognize. Some of the lines had been scorched, as if someone had tried to burn them away, but faint traces remained. Jess's chair faltered as she peered down at it. "It looks ritualistic," she whispered, her usual bubbly tone gone. "Don't be ridiculous," Harold said, but his voice cracked as he said it. The group reconvened in the living room, pale and shaken, each clutching the fragments of what they had found. A picture was forming in their minds, though no one wanted to say it aloud. This cabin wasn't abandoned. It had been used. It had been prepared. And maybe, just maybe, their being here wasn't an accident. As night fell again, the dread deepened. No one wanted to admit it, but they were all listening for the sound of knocking. Dinner was silent. Even Harold stopped pretending everything was fine. At 11:47 p.m., Jess broke down crying, muttering that she wanted to go home, that she couldn't stand another night. Mara put an arm around her, though her own fear made her hands tremble. Dan paced the room, muttering under his breath. Harold poured himself whiskey and sat rigid in the rocking chair by the window, staring out into the black woods. The wind picked up. The shutters rattled. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut on its own. And then, just like the night before, 3 knocks at the door. But this time, it didn't stop. Knock. 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 Pause. Knock. 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 Each set grew louder, harder, reverberating through the cabin until the walls themselves seemed to shake. Jess sobbed openly. Mara clutched the edge of the table. Dan grabbed the fireplace poker, though his knuckles were white with fear. Harold stood, jaw tight, moving toward the door. "It's just some idiot screwing with us," he insisted, though his words shook. He gripped the knob. The others shouted for him to stop. Jess screamed, "Don't open it." But Harold yanked the door wide. The night outside was empty. No one stood on the porch. But in the earth before the cabin, drawn with perfect precision in some dark, glistening substance, was a circle. A fresh one. And in its center lay something small and wet. A tooth. Human. For a long moment, no one moved. Harold stood frozen in the doorway, the night air curling cold fingers into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine sap. The circle on the ground seemed to pulse in the moonlight, its edges still glistening as if freshly drawn. And that tooth, its ivory slick with something that was not water, lay like an offering. Jess made a choking noise in her throat and stumbled backward. Mara pressed a hand to her mouth, bile burning the back of her throat. Dan muttered a curse under his breath and tightened his grip on the fireplace poker, though his hands trembled so badly that the iron clanged against the floor. "Close it," Mara whispered, her voice ragged. "Harold, close the damn door." But Harold didn't move right away. His eyes were locked on the circle, and for a moment it seemed like he wasn't entirely in control of his body, like the thing outside had him caught in a silent conversation. Only when the wind surged hard enough to make the hinges scream did he blink and slam the door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that felt pathetically inadequate against whatever had drawn that circle. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sounds were Jess's sobs and the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like a slow heartbeat. Finally, Dan broke the silence. "That's it. I'm not staying another night in this place. I don't care if it's midnight. I don't care if we break an ankle in the woods. I am not staying." "You can't just wander into the forest blind," Harold snapped, but his voice lacked its usual managerial certainty. "We'll lose the path. We'll freeze to death. Better that than being, whatever this is for." Dan gestured wildly at the door, the circle, the invisible presence that seemed to press in on all sides. Jess suddenly spoke up through her tears. "The journals," she said. "The ones you both found. They said something about rituals, about the cabin remembering. What if us being here is part of it?" Her voice cracked on the last word. The idea landed heavy in the room, like a stone thrown into deep water. No one wanted to give it shape, but they all felt it coil around them. After a long silence, Mara forced herself to move. "We need answers," she said firmly, though her insides were ice. "We can't just wait for this thing to pick us off. We need to understand what happened here." The others reluctantly agreed, and together they scoured the cabin again. This time, they were less cautious, opening drawers with trembling hands, tearing open closets, overturning cushions. In the attic, under a thick tarp that reeked of mildew, Mara discovered a trunk. Its lid was heavy, its hinges rusted, but inside was a collection of old books, their spines brittle, their pages yellowed. And at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth stiff with dried brown stains, was another diary. They carried it downstairs, laying it on the table under the flickering light of a single lantern. The writing inside was fevered, the ink blotched and smeared as if written by someone shaking. "The circle binds them. The blood feeds them. They cannot cross the threshold, but they can call, they can lure, they can trick. The cabin is their altar, and we are their offering. We fled, but they will wait. They always wait. Until the right number enters again, and then the ritual is complete." The group exchanged horrified looks. Jess whispered, "The right number? What does that mean?" Dan's eyes narrowed. "How many of us are here?" "4, Mara answered. "Why?" Dan swallowed hard. "Maybe that's the number they need." The lantern sputtered just then, its flame shrinking, throwing jagged shadows across their faces. Jess whimpered and clutched Mara's arm. Harold, usually so smug, looked pale and hollow, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Then came a sound from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. 1, 2, 3. They all froze, staring at the ceiling. The sound moved steadily from one end of the hall to the other. Too heavy to be an animal. Too calm to be anything panicked. "We're all down here," Jess whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Who's up there?" Dan raised the poker like it was a weapon, though everyone knew it would be useless against whatever stalked the halls above. Harold, to his credit, squared his shoulders. "We need to know." Against every survival instinct screaming in their heads, the group crept upstairs together, each step groaning under their weight. The hallway stretched before them, the floorboards dark with age, the wallpaper peeling in curling strips. At the far end, the bedroom door stood wide open, though Mara swore she remembered closing it earlier. Inside, the air was ice cold. The wardrobe stood ajar, its moth-eaten dresses swaying gently though no breeze stirred. On the bed, a thick layer of dust had been disturbed, a perfect imprint left behind as if someone, or something, had been lying there. And then, on the wall above the headboard, words appeared. Not written with pen or paint, but smeared thickly, freshly, as if scrawled with a finger dipped in blood. 4 inside. 1 more outside. Jess screamed. The lantern sputtered out completely, plunging them into darkness. and from the woods beyond the cabin, faint at first but unmistakable, came the sound of a voice calling. A woman's voice. Sweet. Melodic. Beckoning. It called Mara's name. The voice drifted through the cabin walls like smoke, curling into their ears, filling their minds with a strange warmth that contradicted the cold night pressing against the wooden frame of the house. Mara froze at the sound of her own name carried so tenderly, as though whispered by someone she had once loved and longed to see again. Her breath caught in her throat, every nerve inside her screaming to run, yet her feet betrayed her, itching to step forward. It didn't feel like an intrusion, it felt like a promise, a balm, as if the voice outside knew every secret crack in her heart. Jess clutched her tighter. "Don't listen," she cried, her voice shrill and breaking. "It's not her, Mara, it's not anyone." But Mara's eyes were glassy, her body trembling in a strange rhythm, as though she were caught between waking and dreaming. Harold grabbed Mara's shoulder and shook her violently, snapping her back to herself for a moment. She stumbled, gasping, and collapsed against the wall, her hands clamped over her ears. Dan, jaw clenched, turned toward the open window at the end of the hall. The moonlight poured in, pale and unforgiving, illuminating the tree line beyond. He could see nothing there, nothing but branches swaying in the wind. And yet the voice continued, low and steady, weaving between the rustle of leaves, calling again, this time his name. His grip tightened on the poker, his knuckles bone white, and he whispered, almost to himself, "How does it know me?" The diary on the table downstairs had not prepared them for this, the intelligence, the personal knowledge, the way the thing outside seemed to probe their memories like fingers pressing into soft flesh. The voice didn't just call, it knew. Then the floor beneath their feet groaned, not from their weight but from something moving underneath the boards. The sound slithered along the length of the hall, like something dragging itself slowly through the foundations. Jess whimpered and buried her face in her hands, refusing to look. Harold hissed, "It's not outside anymore." Suddenly, the door to the master bedroom slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang, locking them inside. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the entire cabin seemed to shudder. Jess screamed and bolted for the handle, rattling it uselessly, tears streaking down her cheeks. Mara pushed off the wall and joined her, pounding the wood until her fists ached, but the door wouldn't budge. And then, from the corner of the room, came a sound that didn't belong. A slow, rasping inhale. Followed by a long, rattling exhale. It was the unmistakable rhythm of breath, someone breathing in the same space as them. Dan swung the poker wildly toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows clinging too thickly in the corners. The breathing continued, steady, patient, almost amused. "Light," Harold muttered desperately. "We need light." His hands fumbled with the lantern, but the wick had drowned in cold oil. In the momentary flashes of moonlight, they saw shapes flickering against the walls, tall and wrong, moving independently of their own bodies. Jess backed into the wardrobe, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "It's here. It never left. It was always waiting." As if in response, the breathing ceased. Silence flooded the room, thick and suffocating. For one unbearable heartbeat, it seemed like nothing existed except the pounding of their blood. Then, directly against Mara's ear, impossibly close, a voice whispered, not sweet, not melodic this time, but guttural, scraping, filled with hunger. "The ritual begins, tonight." The wardrobe door behind Jess creaked open slowly, though no hand touched it. A cold draft spilled out, carrying with it the coppery tang of old blood. Her scream split the night as something pale and thin reached out of the darkness within. The entity didn't emerge fully, not at first. It lingered in the edges of perception, a pale, dripping shadow that seemed to coil along the walls, slinking through the cracks in the floorboards, whispering their names in voices both familiar and grotesquely warped. Every step they took made the cabin groan beneath them, like the house itself was alive and complicit in whatever ritual it had been waiting centuries to complete. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, the scent clinging to their hair, their skin, their lungs. Each inhale tasted of something old and terrible. Mara pressed herself into the corner of the room, feeling the walls close in around her, each heartbeat hammering in her ears. Jess was crouched in the wardrobe, shaking, whispering a string of prayers she hadn't remembered knowing. Dan held the poker like a lifeline, eyes darting, muscles taut with readiness and fear, every nerve screaming that something was inches from him, watching, waiting. Harold, usually the anchor of their little group, sat on the edge of the bed, frozen, staring at the far wall where the shadows coalesced into forms too vague to comprehend. Then came the first touch. Mara didn't see it coming. 1 second she was breathing in shallow, terrified gulps of air, and the next, an icy hand brushed against her shoulder. She froze, muscles locking in pure panic, unable to scream, unable to move, her mind flooded with images not her own, rituals she hadn't witnessed, faces she didn't know crying out in silent terror, the smell of fire and iron and wet earth pressing into her senses. Jess screamed, and that sound seemed to feed the cabin, feeding whatever waited in the darkness. The air thickened, the shadows expanding and writhing like living things. The floor beneath them vibrated subtly, a low hum resonating through bone and marrow, until Dan could no longer tell if it was coming from the cabin or from himself. "Get out!" Jess shrieked, vaulting from the wardrobe. She ran toward the door, but it slammed in her face with a force that sent a splinter flying. She stumbled backward into Mara, and together they collided with Harold, knocking him to the floor. The entity's whispers rose in pitch and volume, threading into their minds, pushing, tugging, promising salvation if they only obeyed, threatening annihilation if they resisted. And then the first blood appeared. Not from them, not yet, but on the walls, thin streaks, fresh, glistening, trailing downward like tears from some unseen face. The cabin smelled of iron so strongly now that it made their eyes water. Mara gagged, leaning over the edge of the bed, trying to catch her breath. Dan gritted his teeth, raising the poker, and swung blindly at the shadows, but his arms passed through nothing, through air that felt thicker than reality itself. Something moved in the corner. Pale, twisted, almost human, but stretched, elongated, and wet with what glimmered like condensation or worse. It lurched toward them, too fast to track, yet its every motion deliberate. And then, just as suddenly, it froze in place, almost as if studying them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Run!" Mara shouted, and the words ripped through the room, breaking the paralyzing fear for a heartbeat. They bolted toward the stairs, only to find them warped, elongated, impossibly long, leading not where they expected but to a darkened hall they hadn't noticed before. The hallway seemed endless. Every step reverberated with whispers, each one naming a secret they'd tried to bury, the fear of failure, betrayal, lies they'd told to climb the corporate ladder, jealousies, and betrayals that gnawed at their relationships. Mara realized with horror that the cabin didn't just prey on their bodies, it fed on their minds, twisting their memories and fears into tangible terror. Dan grabbed a door handle at random, swinging it open. The room beyond was worse than anything they had imagined, a circle of symbols etched deep into the floorboards, some lines scorched, others slick with a dark liquid. Candles, long burned down the stubs, were scattered in a careless, ritualistic arrangement. In the center, a book lay open, its pages filled with writing in a hand Mara didn't recognize, yet seemed vaguely familiar, like a memory she didn't know was hers. And then, the whispers became voices. Clear, distinct, chanting in a language they didn't know but understood on a gut level. Complete the circle. Feed the cabin. Become one. Mara's stomach dropped. She understood, suddenly, that the ritual from the journals, from the diaries, from the writings they had brushed off as warnings, wasn't some old story. It was active, and they were now part of it. The cabin had waited for this exact moment, this precise alignment of people, 4, or maybe 5, counting whatever lurked just out of sight. Harold, shaking violently, tried to speak. It won't get us if we," his words cut off as the floor beneath him creaked sharply, a panel giving way just enough to reveal a shallow pit below, lined with blackened soil and bones. The smell hit them all at once, choking, metallic, alive. Jess screamed again, and Mara thought she saw the shadow lean forward, almost as if acknowledging her fear personally. Before anyone could react further, the candle stubs around the room flickered violently, and the shadows detached from the corners of the walls like ribbons of darkness, coiling toward them. The voices swelled, overwhelming thought, memory, and reality, until Mara could no longer tell where the cabin ended and the entity began. A hand, wet and cold, slammed into her back, pushing her forward toward the circle. She turned to scream, but saw the others dragged behind her, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror, limbs jerking against an invisible hold. The last thing she heard before the whispers swallowed everything was the chant. 1, 2, 3, 4, complete. And then, silence. The world narrowed to the circle. Everything else, the walls, the ceiling, the creaking floors, blurred into shadow. Mara's heart hammered like a war drum in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as if the cabin itself was synchronizing with her panic. The air was impossibly thick now, saturated with the iron tang of blood and the acrid stench of decay. Candle stubs flickered weakly, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to slither along the walls, elongating into forms that whispered with voices not their own. Mara struggled to lift her hands, to resist, but it was useless. Invisible threads wrapped around her limbs, pulling her toward the center of the circle. Around her, the others were similarly restrained. Jess's scream shattered the oppressive silence, cutting short as a shadow detached itself from the far corner and enveloped her in a wave of icy darkness. Harold's attempts to fight were feeble, his limbs flailed against the invisible bonds as he choked on terror. Dan's poker clattered uselessly to the floor as he was forced forward, his wide eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath their feet. The circle pulsed with light, faint at first, like the glow of embers under ash, then brighter, brighter, until it seared their vision. Symbols etched into the wood glimmered red-hot, smoldering as if alive, each line a conduit for something ancient and ravenous. Mara felt it through every fiber of her being, the cabin feeding, calculating, weaving their fear, their memories, their very essence into the ritual. She realized then, with a cold, horrifying clarity, that it wasn't just the cabin that was alive. It was the entity, the shadows, the whispers, the circle, it was the ritual itself. A voice spoke, low and hollow, yet threaded through with all the voices of the past occupants whose fates they had glimpsed in the journals. Complete. Become. Return. The words wrapped around Mara's mind, tugging, slicing, bending reality. She saw visions, previous groups of people, trapped, their faces frozen in silent screams, etched into the walls like faint stains that pulsed with unholy life. The entity wanted more than just their bodies. It wanted their essence, their memories, their fears, their very souls. Mara's stomach turned violently as she noticed the floorboards shifting beneath her. The circle was changing, morphing, forming a symbol she didn't recognize but understood instinctively. It was a seal, a gateway, a binding. And in the center, the pit from which Harold had recoiled earlier gaped wider, revealing skeletal remains arranged meticulously, almost ceremoniously. The cabin had been waiting for them. Every creak, every knock, every whisper, they had been guided here, lured into completing what had begun decades ago. Jess's screams rose again, raw and primal, as a pale, dripping shape emerged from the shadows of the corner. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow, and its elongated hands reached outward, grasping at them. The air rippled as if reality itself were warping, bending under the pressure of its presence. The shadow moved unnaturally, coiling like smoke and water simultaneously. It was beautiful and horrific, and Mara understood, with bone-deep clarity, that they were all in the final act of something older than any of them could comprehend. Dan's voice cracked as he shouted, "We can fight it. We have to." But the words were hollow, powerless. The circle's pull was relentless. It coiled tighter, squeezing their bodies, draining strength, filling every sense with a suffocating dread. Mara felt herself fading, her identity splintering, pieces of herself being pulled toward the center of the circle. Faces of past victims flashed before her eyes, screaming silently, warning silently, but it was too late. Harold's eyes went wide as the floorboards beneath him ignited faintly with spectral fire. He tried to shout, but the air seemed to reject his voice. Jess was lifted from the ground as if weightless, her body suspended in a haze of darkness that wrapped around her like silk made of shadows. Mara could see her own reflection in the faint glow of the circle, a reflection that wasn't herself, but a hollow, twisted version, screaming silently, pulling at her from the other side of some invisible barrier. The chanting began, rising from the very walls, the ceiling, the floorboards themselves. A chorus of whispers, moans, and guttural words filled the room, blending into one unholy hymn. 4. Complete, the ritual begins, return, feed. Mara felt her mind bending, memories of office meetings, corporate lunches, petty rivalries, all of it stripped away, feeding the insatiable entity beneath the cabin's floors. And then came the first scream of transformation. Dan's body convulsed violently, limbs twisting unnaturally. He gasped for breath that didn't come as shadows seeped into his skin, filling him with cold fire. Mara could feel it reaching toward her, trying to split her consciousness, draw her into the same darkness. She clawed at the floor, desperate to resist, but the circle's pull was absolute. Outside, the wind shrieked, rattling the cabin violently. The trees bent unnaturally, creaking in chorus with the cabin's own tortured symphony. The moonlight flickered, illuminating fleeting glimpses of shapes moving in the woods, shapes that had no right to exist in the natural world. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a summoning. The cabin was calling something older, hungrier, and it had been waiting for them all along. Mara's vision blurred. She realized that time itself had slowed, hours, minutes, and seconds no longer had meaning. Everything was compressed into the unbearable, the eternal, the now. And then, through the chorus of shadows, she heard it clearly, a voice not in her head, not in the cabin, but from somewhere deeper, beneath, through the stones and soil. Welcome home. You are ours. Complete the circle. The room shuddered violently. The walls groaned, the ceiling split slightly, and a black mist began to rise from the pit in the center of the circle, curling upward like tendrils of smoke, carrying whispers, screams, memories, and fear. Mara could feel it threading into her very soul, claiming her essence, and she realized with horror that escape was no longer an option. The cabin would not release them. Not until the ritual was complete. And then, just as suddenly, the chanting stopped. Silence fell. Thick, heavy, suffocating silence. For one unbearable moment, Mara thought she might survive. Then the shadows in the corners of the room began to move on their own accord, inching toward them, patient, deliberate, and hungry. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, turning viscous as though the cabin had become a living trap, breathing, pulsating with intent. Every step they took across the floorboards sent shivers up their spines, the wood groaning beneath their weight like it resented their intrusion. Mara's lungs ached, not from exertion, but from the oppressive density of fear that filled the room, a substance heavier than air, pressing down on her chest. Every inhale carried the stench of iron and decay, every exhale felt as though the cabin were sucking her very soul. Shadows moved independently now, no longer constrained to corners or walls. They slithered along the floor, climbing over furniture, coiling around each of them with the patience of predators. Dan tried to swing his poker, but it passed through one of the shadows as if it were smoke. A cold, alien weight slammed into his chest, forcing him to his knees. He struggled, but the floor beneath him seemed to ripple like liquid, swallowing his movements, dragging him closer to the pit in the center of the circle. Jess screamed as the wardrobe erupted into motion, doors flailing violently. Dresses hung in the air, spinning, twisting around her as if alive. She fell backward, hitting the floor hard, and the shadows moved faster, converging on her like a storm. Mara lunged, grabbing her friend, but a tendril of darkness wrapped around her arm, pulling her backward. Her scream joined Jess's in a horrifying chorus that filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls, amplified by the malevolent architecture that had been designed for this very purpose. The pit in the center glowed faintly now, red-hot at its edges, smoke curling upward. Inside, the skeletal remains from the previous victims seemed to twitch, rearranging themselves in impossible, jerking motions, forming shapes that made Mara's stomach lurch. She realized then that the cabin wasn't just feeding, it was recreating, merging the living with the dead, blending past and present into a tableau of terror that would never let go. Harold tried to shout orders, tried to rally the group, but his voice cracked like dry wood. We need to stay together." But the shadows ignored his plea. They wrapped around the four of them, bending light and space, turning the room into a labyrinth that shifted with every heartbeat. Mara felt as though the ceiling was sinking, the walls stretching, and the floor rising to meet her feet. Time lost all meaning, seconds stretched into eternities, minutes became hours, and yet the terror remained constant, relentless. Something brushed against her neck. Not cold, not warm, but wrong. It carried the taste of rust, of iron, of soil that had buried corpses decades ago. She whirled, catching a glimpse of movement, an elongated, thin arm, pale and slick, stretching impossibly from the corner. Its fingers were tipped with jagged nails, dripping with something dark. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, the same hue that Mara had glimpsed before, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, emitting a low, guttural chant that matched the pulse of the circle. Jess screamed again as she vanished into one of the moving shadows, pulled screaming into the corner. Mara reached for her, but the arm lashed out, slapping her back with supernatural force. She hit the floor hard, pain exploding through her shoulder, but the shadows didn't pause. They coiled around Dan next, dragging him toward the pit. Harold was frozen, screaming silently as the floor beneath him rippled like black water, swallowing him inches at a time. Mara's mind spun. The diary entries, the journals, they had all warned them, but she hadn't fully understood. The cabin's power wasn't just supernatural, it was calculated, patient, centuries in the making. Every creak, every knock, every wind-whipped sound had been a lure, a test, a way to select its next victims. And now, they were trapped. There was no escaping the geometry of fear that had been built into every corner, every floorboard, every beam. Her legs moved on their own, propelling her toward the circle, the pit at its center. Something in the cabin wanted her there, wanted them all there. She saw the skeletal remains twitch once more, as if alive, forming shapes that mirrored the bodies of her friends. The shadows pressed closer, whispering names, promises, threats. The ritual is near completion. Mara reached out, desperate, and her fingers brushed the edge of the circle. The floorboards trembled beneath her touch, a vibration that traveled up her arms and into her chest. The shadows surged, swirling into a vortex of darkness, sound, and fear. The pit widened, pulling the four of them inexorably closer, while the cabin itself seemed to lean inward, walls bending, ceilings sloping, swallowing reality like a living mouth. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Mara saw it, a pale figure, barely human, standing upright from the pit. Its skin was ashen, eyes hollow but glowing faintly, hands outstretched as though it had been waiting for her. And in its mouth, the whisper that would echo in her mind forever. "Complete the circle, become one with us." The moment Mara's fingers brushed the circle, reality itself seemed to fracture. The walls pulsed like living flesh, bending inward and outward in a rhythm that echoed the beat of her terrified heart. The shadows around them thickened, becoming almost tangible, coiling around their bodies like serpents of black smoke. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the cabin were pressing down on her, shaping her movements with invisible hands. Jess's screams still rang in her ears, but now they were layered with other sounds, voices of long-dead occupants, overlapping, chanting in tongues she couldn't understand, yet somehow comprehending in the marrow of her bones. Dan was the first to falter. His body convulsed violently as the shadows coiled around him, stretching and elongating his limbs in impossible angles. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the room itself, absorbed into the oppressive atmosphere. His skin rippled unnaturally where the shadows touched, veins darkening, eyes widening until the whites glowed faintly in the dim, sickly light of the circle. Mara could see him being rewritten, reshaped, a puppet for the ritual's will. Harold tried to run, pounding toward the stairs, but the floor moved beneath him. Panels lifted and shifted like waves, bending his path into impossible geometry, funneling him back toward the circle. He fell, hands scraping the floor, eyes wide with terror as a shadow erupted from beneath, wrapping him in darkness that felt wet and alive. The whispers in his mind became a chorus, forcing him to see visions of failures, betrayals, and the dark secrets he had hidden from everyone, even from himself. His screams merged with the cabin, becoming part of the soundscape, part of the ritual. Mara's own body began to tremble uncontrollably. Her reflection in the flickering light of the circle was no longer herself, her features twisted subtly, elongating, shadows creeping across her skin like ink spilled in water. She felt her mind splintering, pieces of her consciousness being pulled toward the center of the circle, leaving behind a hollow shell. The whispers weren't just voices, they were entities, probing, digging, claiming, pressing her memories and fears into the shape of the ritual. Jess emerged briefly from the shadows, her body jerking in unnatural rhythms, eyes rolled back so only the white showed. She clawed at Mara, voice barely human. "Join us, complete." Mara recoiled, but the pull was irresistible. The pit at the center of the circle grew wider, black mist rising from it like smoke from a burning abyss, carrying the echo of screams from centuries past. The skeletal remains inside twisted, forming grotesque mockeries of her friends, their faces flickering between the living and the dead. The cabin itself seemed to sigh with satisfaction. The walls groaned, bending impossibly, swallowing corners and ceilings, folding space as if it were made of rubber. Windows became mirrors of black, reflecting visions of what they would become, hollow, bound to the cabin, consumed by the ritual. Mara's stomach churned violently as she realized the cabin wasn't just feeding on them, it was transforming them, reshaping them into vessels for its centuries-long hunger. A cold hand, or something colder than any human touch, touched Mara's cheek. Her skin rippled under its touch, flesh stretching unnaturally, hair lengthening and twisting as the shadows coiled into her being. Her mind screamed in protest, memories of home, of her family, of her life outside this nightmare, pressing against the consuming darkness. But the circle's pull was absolute. She was becoming part of the ritual, part of the cabin's endless cycle. The others were no longer human in any recognizable sense. Dan's limbs jerked with mechanical precision, Harold's eyes flickered with multiple irises, Jess's voice had split into dozens of harmonics, all chanting the words of the ritual. Mara's last coherent thought, the fragile part of her mind that still clung to reality, was that she had to resist. She had to fight, even if the cabin had already begun claiming her. And then, from the pit, the pale figure rose fully into the room. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly yellow as the shadows, its body a twisted, skeletal mockery of life. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and the whispers coalesced into a single, guttural command. Become one, complete the circle, eternity awaits. The air trembled with the weight of inevitability. Mara felt herself pulled forward, toward the pit, toward the twisting, writhing shadows, toward the moment where she would either resist or succumb completely. Every fiber of her being screamed to fight, but the cabin pressed harder, bending space, time, and willpower itself. Her hands brushed the edge of the pit, and in that instant, the whispers changed. They weren't just voices anymore. They were promises, memories of all who had come before, calling to her, begging her, mocking her. Mara felt a piece of herself leave her body, sinking into the blackness, as the cabin's hunger pressed in, folding her reality into its own. The floorboard beneath her quaked violently, throwing her and the others off balance. The shadows surged, thickening into a tide of black, twisting figures, each one reaching, grasping, claiming. The pit widened further, an infinite maw of darkness that promised either release or obliteration. And Mara realized, with a gut-chilling certainty, that the ritual was no longer about feeding the cabin. It was about creating it. The cabin had been patient for centuries, waiting for the perfect alignment, the right number, the right souls. And now, with Mara and her friends trapped at the center of the circle, the culmination was at hand. The black mist that rose from the pit thickened into a nearly solid mass, undulating as if alive, tendrils reaching out to ensnare every inch of the cabin's interior. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of iron and decay, pressing down on Mara's chest so that every breath was a struggle. The shadows had multiplied, writhing along the walls and floorboards, sliding over the four of them like serpents, probing their weaknesses, testing their resistance. They whispered incessantly, each voice a fragment of memory, fear, and regret, weaving together a tapestry of torment so personal it left Mara dizzy, nauseous, and terrified beyond reason. Dan convulsed again, his body twisting in unnatural angles, limbs stretching impossibly long before snapping back into grotesque contortions. His eyes rolled back, glowing a pale yellow as if the cabin itself had taken residence inside him. Harold, face pale and slick with sweat, screamed as a shadow coiled around his torso, pressing him against the floor. His voice became a chorus of echoes, overlapping with the whispers of centuries past. Jess, too, was no longer entirely herself, her body jerking in horrifying synchronicity with the rhythm of the circle, chanting words that she didn't know she could speak, languages not meant for human tongues. Mara tried to pull away, but invisible forces gripped her, tugging her inexorably toward the pit. It seemed to stretch beneath her, a yawning void that expanded endlessly, lined with skeletal remains and shadowy forms that had once been previous victims. Every step toward the center was a battle against the cabin's weight, the gravity of its malevolent intent pressing down on her. And then she saw it, the entity itself emerging from the black mist. At first, it was formless, a mass of shadows and mist coiling in the air, pulsating with malevolence. Then the form began to solidify, limbs taking shape, elongated and thin, skin a pale, sickly gray that shimmered like wet stone. Its head tilted at unnatural angles, jaws stretching wider than possible, teeth jagged and glistening. Glowing yellow eyes pierced the dim light, burning with a hunger so profound it seemed to consume the very air around it. Mara could feel its gaze not just upon her, but inside her, reading every thought, every fear, every fragment of her soul. The shadows converged, connecting the entity to each of her friends, linking them in a lattice of darkness that vibrated with unnatural energy. The whispers intensified, turning into a guttural chant that resonated through the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The cabin itself vibrated with a low hum, as if the structure were alive, feeding on the fear and agony of the trapped humans. Mara felt herself beginning to fracture, pieces of her consciousness being siphoned into the entity's form. Memories of home, of family, of life outside the cabin, blurred and stretched, slipping from her mind as the ritual demanded more, hungrier. The shadows moved faster now, coiling into shapes that twisted her friends into grotesque mockeries of themselves. Limbs stretched impossibly, faces contorted, eyes glowed, and yet, through it all, she could see their consciousness flicker, small, fragile sparks struggling against the darkness. The entity's voice echoed, not from its mouth, but from everywhere at once, vibrating inside her skull. Become one, complete the circle, eternity is yours. Mara realized, with a jolt of panic, that it wasn't just asking, they would not survive unless the ritual was completed. Their resistance would be absorbed, their essence folded into the entity itself. She could feel it, pulling at her very being, threading into her body and mind, turning her fear into fuel. Harold's body convulsed violently, screams erupting from him as he was bent toward the pit. Shadows wrapped around his chest and arms, dragging him closer, while skeletal hands emerged from the floorboards to grip his ankles. Jess's chanting intensified, her form flickering between human and shadow, as if the entity was sculpting her into something new, something eternal. Dan's eyes glowed fiercely, yet there was a flicker of awareness, a spark of resistance fighting against the inevitable. Mara's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might burst. She struggled with all her strength against the invisible bonds, trying to drag herself backward, to pull herself away from the maw of the pit. But the cabin refused, warping space to funnel her toward the center, toward the entity. The floor beneath her feet seemed to undulate like water, and the walls stretched impossibly, bending the room into a twisted, impossible geometry. Time itself felt fractured, moments stretching into eternities, the ritual dragging them into its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. And then, the entity loomed over her, towering and magnificent in its horror. It bent forward, head cocked, eyes locking with hers, and whispered directly into her mind, "You belong to this place, to me, to the circle, forever." The shadows surged, tendrils lashing out, threading into her body, her mind, her soul. The whispers became screams, the screams became a symphony of pain, despair, and inevitability. Mara realized then that the cabin, the entity, the ritual, they were not just consuming her friends, they were becoming her friends, folding their identities into an eternal cycle of horror. Her vision blurred, body trembling violently, consciousness fraying at the edges. The pit expanded beneath her, black mist curling upward, alive with the faces of centuries past. And in that moment, she understood the terrifying truth: resistance was futile. Survival wasn't an option. To exist in this place was to become part of it, to join the endless chain of souls claimed by the cabin's ancient, unrelenting hunger. Mara's body screamed in protest, trembling violently as the shadow's tendrils burrowed into her flesh, threading into her veins, her bones, and her mind. Every nerve in her body felt aflame and frozen simultaneously, a contradiction that left her disoriented, nauseous, and terrified beyond measure. She clawed at the floor, desperate to escape the pull of the pit, but the cabin had already claimed her momentum, bending gravity and space to force her forward. Her friends were no longer fully recognizable. Dan's arms had elongated grotesquely, skeletal fingers now tipped with jagged claws. Jess's body flickered between human and shadow, her chanting unintelligible but hypnotic. Harold's face had split unnaturally, eyes multiplying like insect facets, yet he still screamed in sheer terror. The pit's black mist coiled upward, reaching into the ceiling as if threading itself through the entire cabin. Faces swirled within it, screaming, laughing, begging, mocking. Mara recognized a few, previous occupants from decades ago, preserved in the entity's memory, twisted into eternal servitude. And now, she and her friends were to join them, to be folded into the ritual's unending cycle. She felt herself slipping, consciousness fraying, memories of home and life eroding as the entity pressed further into her mind, weaving a tapestry of fear and despair. Dan's voice broke through briefly, a shred of humanity struggling to fight the overwhelming darkness. "Mara, fight, don't," his words cut off as a shadow wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the floor. The tendrils penetrated his skin, threading into his nerves, reshaping his body in accordance with the ritual. He flailed, screaming, but each movement fed the entity, accelerated the completion of the circle. Mara tried to reach him, but her hands passed through him as though he had already become partially spectral, a vessel in transition between life and the cabin's hunger. Jess's body twitched violently, limbs bending at impossible angles, her voice layered in dozens of harmonics that pulsed with the rhythm of the ritual. The cabin itself seemed to feed on the sound, amplifying it, bending it into a resonance that penetrated every bone, every thought, every soul. Mara's own mind teetered on the edge of collapse, fragmented by the relentless pressure of fear, pain, and the entity's unholy influence. She felt herself being pulled into the pit, threads of darkness wrapping around her waist, wrists, and ankles, anchoring her to the center. The skeletal remains at the pit's bottom shifted unnaturally, rising in grotesque synchrony as if recognizing new additions to the cycle. Mara could see faint, ghostly imprints of her friends' forms etched into the black mist, superimposed over her own reflection in the flickering candlelight. It was an image of the future, her friends, and herself, rewritten, consumed, eternal. The cabin was patient, infinitely patient. Centuries of rituals had trained it to bend reality around its hunger, to mold its victims into permanent extensions of its will. Harold screamed again, the sound layered with dozens of other voices, echoing, overlapping, intertwining into a horrific cacophony. He convulsed violently as tendrils coiled around him, reshaping his flesh and bone. Eyes appeared where none should exist, his limbs fractured and reformed repeatedly, yet each time his consciousness flickered, a fragile spark of resistance fighting against the inevitable. Mara tried to call to him, to anchor him to some shred of humanity, but the cabin's pull was too strong. The pit expanded beneath her feet, widening into a yawning abyss that seemed infinite. Shadows flowed from it, reaching toward her with fluid, predatory grace. She felt herself bending toward the darkness, her body reshaping under forces she could neither resist nor comprehend. Her fingers elongated slightly, tendrils of shadow seeping along her skin, threading into her nerves, binding her to the ritual. Every memory, every fear, every secret she had held close was extracted, twisted, and pressed into the cabin's hunger. And then, the entity spoke directly into her mind, louder than ever, resonating in every fiber of her being. "You belong to this place, you are part of the circle, eternity is your destiny." Mara screamed, but even her voice had lost its power. The shadows coiled tighter, threading deeper, reshaping her into something she barely recognized, a vessel for the cabin's centuries-long hunger. Dan, Jess, and Harold were similarly transformed, partially consumed, partially resisting, their forms twisting between human and shadow in horrifying synchronicity. The cabin vibrated with power, a living symphony of suffering and hunger, resonating with the very souls it consumed. Through the chaos, Mara caught a glimpse of the skeletal forms rising from the pit, now animated with faint traces of the cabin's previous victims. They reached outward, joining the shadows, integrating into the ritual as both observers and participants. The room itself seemed to stretch and contract, the walls bending impossibly, the ceiling elongating into dark voids, the floor sinking and rising like liquid. Time and space had become irrelevant, the ritual existed outside reality itself. Mara's last coherent thought, before the shadows began to claim her entirely, was of resistance, a fragile spark refusing to be extinguished. She realized that while the cabin could claim her body, her consciousness might yet remain, a shard of awareness in the darkness. But even as that thought formed, the entity's presence pressed further, smothering her will, twisting her perception, merging her essence with the unholy rhythm of the ritual. The cabin had begun its work, and there was no turning back. The ritual was no longer a threat, it was a certainty. The cabin had become unrecognizable. Walls stretched into impossible angles, floors rippled like water, and shadows moved independently, twisting reality around Mara and her friends. The air vibrated with an almost tangible malice, pressing down on her chest, filling her lungs with the taste of iron and despair. The pit at the center had widened into a black chasm that seemed infinite, pulsating with a dark rhythm that synchronized with her own heartbeat. Tendrils of shadow surged outward, wrapping around every inch of the room, anchoring them to the ritual. Dan was the first to scream, not in fear, but in pain as the shadows reformed his body yet again. Limbs stretched, bones twisted, eyes multiplied, and he gasped for air that didn't exist. Jess's body flickered between human and shadow, chanting incomprehensible words that became part of the cabin's symphony. Harold convulsed violently, every scream overlapping with the chorus of the cabin's past victims, now fully merged into the entity's will. Mara's own body trembled, tendrils of shadow threading into her nerves, her muscles, her very soul. She felt herself fragmenting, her essence being drawn into the pit. But amid the chaos, a spark of awareness remained. Mara realized that the cabin, the ritual, the entity, they thrived on fear and despair. Every moment of panic, every scream, every sense of helplessness fed it. If she could still think clearly, even for a second, perhaps she could resist, even if just enough to create a crack in its control. Her mind, sharp and focused amid the maelstrom, sought a weakness, a point where the ritual's rhythm faltered. And she saw it, the entity itself, hovering above the pit, not fully anchored to the cabin yet, a form made of shadows and pale, sickly flesh. Its attention was divided, tethered to her friends, to the pit, to the very walls. Mara's pulse hammered. She summoned every ounce of willpower, focusing on the tiniest shred of fear she could suppress. She forced her body to move, ignoring the pull of the shadows, stepping backward, then sideways, weaving around the writhing tendrils that sought to bind her. The entity's glowing eyes snapped toward her, and she felt its hunger, the pulse of centuries of ritualistic consumption, pressing against her mind. But she held firm, drawing on memories of home, of life outside the cabin, of people she loved. They were anchors, fragile yet unyielding, fragments of reality the entity could not consume entirely. The shadows surged in response, lashing outward, attempting to overwhelm her resistance. Dan's form, twisted and grotesque, lunged involuntarily, claws slicing the air, but Mara ducked, narrowly avoiding the grasping hands of the half-transformed Jess. Harold, already far gone, thrashed in the shadows, a terrifying mockery of a human being. The cabin shuddered violently, walls bending unnaturally, as if struggling to maintain its shape against Mara's defiance. And then she acted. With one hand, she grabbed a long, charred beam, swinging it with all her strength at the edge of the pit. The impact resonated through the cabin, vibrating along the floorboards, rattling the skeletal forms rising from the pit. The shadows recoiled momentarily, giving her the smallest gap, a sliver of space to maneuver. The entity hissed, a sound that was not entirely human, a blend of whispers, growls, and the echoes of countless victims. Its eyes blazed, tendrils of shadow lashing outward in a flurry of anger. Mara seized the moment. She lunged toward the pit, diving with every ounce of strength left, driving the beam downward with precision. The impact shattered the air, sending waves of force through the shadows, causing the skeletal forms to falter, flicker, and partially collapse back into the pit. The entity recoiled, a screeching chorus of voices erupting from it as the ritual's rhythm wavered. For a heartbeat, the cabin was still. Time seemed suspended, the walls frozen, the shadows hesitating. Mara gasped, pulling herself to the very edge of the pit. She could feel the pull, could feel the entity's hunger pressing against her, desperate to reclaim her, to consume her essence. But she held on, refusing to give in, refusing to let centuries of ritual claim her soul. The entity, now partially exposed and tethered only to the pit and the twisted remains of her friends, began to writhe violently. Its form flickered, unstable, as if the disruption had created a flaw in its construction. Shadows detached from her friends, coiling back toward the entity, attempting to repair the breach. Mara's mind raced. She understood instinctively, to survive, she had to force the entity entirely back into the pit, to collapse the circle and break its hold on reality. Drawing on the last of her strength, Mara raised the beam once more, aiming at the heart of the pit where the entity's tether to the ritual seemed most concentrated. The shadows lashed at her, coiling around her arms and legs, but she fought, channeling every shred of willpower, every memory of who she was, every flicker of human defiance into a single, desperate strike. The moment the beam struck, a shockwave exploded through the cabin. Shadows screamed, skeletal forms collapsed, the pit shuddered violently, and the entity let out a sound that pierced Mara's mind, a scream of frustration, rage, and unearthly pain. The circle trembled, the cabin groaned, and for a fleeting, terrifying instant, everything froze. Mara barely had time to comprehend what she had done before the shadows surged back, threatening to reclaim her and her friends. But she noticed something. The entity, now partially weakened, recoiled into the pit, tethered but not fully manifest. There was a sliver of hope, fragile and fleeting, yet undeniable. The cabin trembled violently, walls twisting in impossible angles as the pit writhed at its center, the shadows screaming in a chorus of pain, fury, and ancient hunger. Mara clung to the edge, the beam still in her hands, her body trembling from exhaustion and terror. The entity, partially tethered to the pit, pulsed with dark energy, its form flickering between corporeal and shadow, a grotesque mockery of humanity. Every fiber of her being screamed that it was impossible to survive, yet she knew instinctively that this was the moment that would define everything. Either they became part of the cabin's eternal cycle, or they ended it. Dan, barely recognizable, leaned against the warped floor, his elongated limbs twitching in synchronization with the shadows, eyes flickering with small sparks of awareness. Jess floated halfway between human and shadow, chanting fragments of the ritual as if trapped in two worlds at once. Harold's form had shattered completely, a nightmarish lattice of bone and shadow writhing uncontrollably. And Mara's own body was changing, the tendrils of darkness coiling into her veins, yet a core of defiance burned in her mind, fragile but unyielding. The pit expanded further, black mist rising like a storm, the skeletal forms at its bottom stretching into the cabin's warped architecture. The whispers coalesced into a single, deafening voice, resonating directly in Mara's skull. You cannot resist. You are part of us. The circle is eternal. But she refused to yield. She realized that the entity's power relied on fear, on submission, on belief in inevitability. With every ounce of strength, she forced herself to think clearly, to anchor her consciousness to the reality outside the cabin. Memories of home, of sunlight, of laughter, of life, became her shield against the suffocating darkness. With a trembling hand, she slammed the beam downward into the center of the pit, striking the tether that bound the entity to the ritual. Shadows screamed, skeletal forms erupted into chaos, and the pit convulsed violently. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore through the walls and ceilings, reverberating in every corner of the cabin. Mara's heart pounded so hard she feared it would burst, but she didn't stop. She slammed again, over and over, each strike resonating with her defiance, each blow fracturing the entity's hold on reality. The cabin's architecture twisted and groaned, floors bending, walls cracking, ceilings splitting. The shadows recoiled from the pit, screeching as if burned by invisible flames. Dan's elongated limbs snapped back toward his body, Jess's voice faltered, replaced by ragged gasps of consciousness, and Harold's twisted lattice of bone collapsed into motionless form. The ritual's rhythm faltered, the centuries-old cycle of consumption destabilized by her relentless defiance. And then she saw it, the shocking truth behind the cabin. The entity had never been just a spirit or demon, it was the manifestation of the cabin itself, a sentient accumulation of every soul it had consumed over centuries. The pit was not merely a gateway or trap, it was the heart of the cabin's consciousness, the nexus where fear, memory, and life were transformed into its eternal power. Every previous victim had been rewritten into its architecture, their existence folded into walls, floors, and shadows. And now, with her intervention, the cabin's heart was vulnerable, its centuries-long patience on the verge of unraveling. Mara took a deep, shuddering breath, summoning the last fragments of her strength. She drove the beam into the pit one final time, harder than ever, striking not just the tether but the very core of the cabin's consciousness. The shadows erupted in agony, screaming in unison, the skeletal forms collapsing into dust, and the entity let out a piercing wail that seemed to bend reality itself. The pit convulsed, then imploded inward, a vortex of black mist collapsing into nothingness. The cabin shuddered violently one last time, then fell silent. When Mara opened her eyes, the cabin was still. The walls were cracked but solid, the floorboards warped but intact. The oppressive air had lifted, replaced by a tentative calm, almost as if the cabin were mourning the destruction of its centuries-long consciousness. Dan, Jess, and Harold lay scattered across the floor, exhausted but alive, slowly regaining their humanity as the shadows dissipated. The ritual had been broken, the entity destroyed, or at least reduced to nothing more than the haunted memories of a place that would never again hold such power. Mara collapsed, tears streaming down her face, gasping for air that finally felt clean. She looked at her friends, seeing them return, piece by piece, to the people they had been. The cabin, while still eerie and decaying, no longer radiated malice. It was a building once more, rather than a predator. But even as relief washed over her, Mara knew the truth would haunt them forever. The cabin had existed for centuries, patient and meticulous, waiting for its next opportunity. And somewhere, in the shadows of history, other forgotten cabins still waited. As the first rays of dawn pierced the cracked windows, Mara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what they had survived. They had confronted centuries of hunger, terror, and ritualistic malice, and survived. But the memory of the pit, the entity, and the whispers would remain etched in their minds forever, a reminder that some places are alive in ways no human should ever encounter. The cabin stood silent, but the wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. Mara shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that some things, even when defeated, never truly die.